Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was born on a quiet day, December 1st, 1949, in the sleepy town of Rio Negro, nestled in the Antioquia department of Colombia. But it wasn't in Rio Negro that he would grow up. Just a short time after his birth, his family moved to a place that would become central to his legacy, the city of Medellin. His father, Aben de Jesus, was a humble farmer, and his mother, Hermilda, worked as a school teacher, known for her strict manner and fierce pride. They were not wealthy. In fact, they were far from it. The Escobars lived modestly, sometimes barely making ends meet. But from a young age, Pablo showed signs of something more: a sharp mind, restless energy, and a hunger for more than life had handed him.
As a young boy, Pablo wasn't particularly gifted in school, but he was clever, observant. He noticed things others didn't. He understood the power of money long before he had any. According to childhood friends, he would sometimes say that one day he would become Colombia's president, or the richest man in the country. At the time, they laughed. But Pablo was not joking. He began his first hustles early. Still just a teenager, he started stealing tombstones from local cemeteries. He would clean them up, remove the names, and sell them to unscrupulous dealers. It was strange, morbid, but profitable. That hustle turned into others. He sold fake lottery tickets on street corners. He bought stereo equipment smuggled from Panama and flipped it for profit. He sold contraband cigarettes and even helped falsify diplomas and report cards. Every scam, every scheme was a lesson, and Pablo paid attention.
It wasn't long before he graduated to more serious business. In his late teens and early 20s, Pablo began associating with small-time smugglers. These were men who brought in everything from electronics to marijuana, and who had connections to the growing coca trade. Pablo started by offering protection, and quickly learned the logistics behind smuggling routes, law enforcement tactics, and most importantly, bribes. In Colombia at the time, corruption was not rare. It was part of the system. And Pablo understood something early on. In a country where money could buy almost anything, the real power wasn't held by politicians or judges. It was held by those who could afford them. As the 1970s approached, a new drug began capturing the attention of traffickers. It was light, potent, and easy to conceal. And in the United States, it was growing in popularity among wealthy elites: cocaine. And Pablo Escobar was ready to stake his claim.
The early 1970s brought change to Colombia and to the young man named Pablo Escobar. He was now in his early 20s, married to Maria Victoria Henao, a girl he had met when she was just 13 and he was 24. Their relationship, like much of Pablo's life, was complex. But by the time he was a father, he had already begun laying the groundwork for something far larger than street scams. He wasn't content being a middleman or a street dealer. Pablo wanted control. He wanted to own the pipeline. At the time, the cocaine trade was still in its infancy. It wasn't the global empire it would soon become. Coca leaves were grown mostly in Peru and Bolivia, processed into paste and then into pure cocaine in clandestine labs. From there, it was smuggled north into Colombia and then to the United States. The margins were enormous. A kilo of cocaine that cost just a few $1,000s to produce could be sold in the U.S. for over $100,000. Even small operations saw massive returns. Pablo saw it as a business opportunity, but also as a revolution. He believed that by organizing the trade more efficiently, by treating it like a true enterprise, he could dominate it. And so he started building connections. He partnered with chemists who could process high-quality cocaine. He hired pilots, men who had once flown for Colombia's Air Force, and paid them handsomely to fly shipments into the Caribbean, Mexico, and Florida. He bribed airport officials, customs agents, and local police. He learned who could be bought and who needed to be avoided. And when bribery didn't work, intimidation often did. Escobar was methodical, and in many ways, he was disciplined. He demanded loyalty, he promised wealth, and most of all, he delivered results. One of his earliest innovations was hiding cocaine in airplane tires. Small private planes would land briefly on makeshift runways in the Colombian countryside, pick up their loads, and fly north under the radar. Sometimes they dropped shipments from the air into the ocean, where speedboats would recover them. Other times, suitcases would arrive in Miami, carefully packed and marked. The handlers knew which to collect and which to leave. Pablo wasn't just trafficking drugs, he was building a system, a supply chain, and it was working.
By the mid-1970s, his reputation among traffickers was rising. He was known not only for his profits, but for his ruthlessness and reliability. He began consolidating smaller operations under his leadership. He paid well, but made it clear betrayal would not be tolerated. Violence was rare, but decisive. Some said he never raised his voice, that he didn't need to. His reputation spoke for him. The Colombian government at the time largely turned a blind eye. The trade hadn't yet reached the scale that would force international attention, and for many local officials, the cocaine business brought bribes, jobs, and economic activity to otherwise poor regions. In Medellin, Pablo was becoming more than a trafficker. He was becoming a figure of influence, quietly powerful and increasingly wealthy. But the real growth was just beginning. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Pablo Escobar turned his local operation into one of the most powerful drug empires the world has ever known, a cartel that would rival governments.
By the late 1970s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just a rising trafficker. He was becoming a kingmaker in Colombia's criminal world. What began as small-scale smuggling was transforming into a complex, multinational operation. He wasn't simply moving cocaine anymore. He was producing it, protecting it, transporting it, and selling it. And from this control came the birth of the Medellin cartel. Escobar wasn't alone, of course. He formed alliances with other traffickers, men like the Ochoa brothers, Carlos Later, and Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano. Together, they created a network unlike anything the world had seen. Each member had strengths. Carlos Later managed air routes into the Bahamas. The Ochoas helped launder money and enforce loyalty. And Pablo, he was the strategist, the negotiator, the face of the organization. The Medellin cartel built cocaine labs deep in the jungles where aircraft couldn't see them and soldiers wouldn't go. There, teams of workers, sometimes entire villages, would process coca paste into pure white powder. The labs ran day and night, producing hundreds of kilos each week. To protect them, the cartel paid off local police. And when that failed, they armed private militias, sometimes with military-grade weapons. Planes would land on dirt airstrips, load up the cocaine, and fly north. The route was simple: Peru or Bolivia for the leaves, Colombia for processing, and then across the Caribbean to the U.S. But it worked, and it worked on a scale the world wasn't ready for. At its peak, the Medellin cartel was shipping 15 tons of cocaine per day into the United States. 15 tons every day. By the early 1980s, an estimated 80% of the cocaine entering the U.S. came from Escobar and his associates. The profits were astronomical. Escobar reportedly made $420 million a week. He was now one of the richest men on earth,
His net worth climbed into the billions. But where do you keep billions in illegal cash? Pablo's answer was both simple and surreal. He stored money in barns, in underground holes, in abandoned warehouses across Colombia. He hid it in barrels and buried it in fields. According to his brother, by the late 1970s, Pablo Escobar was no longer a rising figure. He was a king in the making. The scale of his operations had grown so large, so quickly, that traditional descriptions no longer fit. He was no longer a smuggler. He was an architect of something vast and dangerous. He had assembled a tight inner circle: family, trusted friends from childhood, and loyal soldiers. At the center of it all was Escobar, calm, calculated, focused. And soon, the world would know the name of the Medellin cartel. This was no small group. The cartel was a full-fledged organization. It had departments for manufacturing, logistics, security, public relations, and, perhaps most importantly, bribery. Cocaine laboratories hidden deep in the Colombian jungle were now working around the clock. These labs could produce hundreds of kilos a day. Workers were paid well and sworn to secrecy. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter. Helicopters were on standby. Every gram was accounted for. From the moment coca leaves were harvested to the instant the pure white powder reached American shores, Pablo's system tracked everything. And that system made him one of the richest men in the world. At its peak, the Medellin cartel was responsible for nearly 80% of all cocaine entering the United States. The profits were staggering. Each month, the cartel earned hundreds of millions of dollars. Each week, planes arrived in Florida, California, and the Caribbean, stuffed with carefully concealed cargo. Sometimes entire jets were retrofitted for transport. Other times, boats, trucks, and even submarines were used. And all that cash? It needed to be stored. Pablo's organization was making so much money that counting it became a full-time job. According to his brother, Roberto Escobar, they spent $2,500 a month on rubber bands just to hold the stacks of bills together. They stored money in warehouses, hidden compartments, and underground bunkers. Many of the bills, millions of dollars worth, were ruined by moisture or eaten by rats. It was the kind of problem only billionaires face. How do you hide and protect a fortune that never stops growing? Escobar's solution was simple: more land, more people, more control. He purchased massive swaths of rural property. The crown jewel of his holdings was Hacienda Nápoles, a sprawling estate located east of Medellin. It had everything: private landing strips, a zoo with elephants, giraffes, and hippos, classic cars, a bull ring, and armed guards at every entrance. To the public, it looked like a rich man's playground. But behind the walls, deals were being made. Cocaine was being routed, and lives were being decided. Hacienda Nápoles was more than a symbol of wealth. It was a nerve center, a fortress, a palace built on powder. Still, for all his grandeur, Pablo never forgot one thing: power required people. And while his money reached the upper levels of government, his heart and his public image remained with the poor. That choice wasn't accidental. It was part of his plan. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Escobar used generosity, fear, and myth to make himself not just rich, but revered. In the poor neighborhoods of Medellin, where dusty roads wound through the hills and families struggled to put food on the table, the name Pablo Escobar was spoken with a different tone. Not as a criminal, not as a drug lord, but as a benefactor.
To some, he was El Patron, a man who gave when others had forgotten them. Escobar understood something deep and lasting about the human heart. He knew that money could buy silence, but kindness could buy loyalty. And so he began to invest, not in banks or businesses, but in people. In neighborhoods where the government had never paved roads, Escobar sent construction crews. Where electricity was spotty, he paid for power lines. Where schools and clinics were falling apart, he funded repairs. But the most famous example was the neighborhood known as Barrio Pablo Escobar. Built on a hillside overlooking Medellin, this community housed thousands of displaced families. Escobar funded its creation, building homes, installing plumbing, creating public spaces. To the people who lived there, he wasn't just a drug trafficker. He was the only man who had ever helped them. He also donated to churches, paid medical bills for strangers, and handed out wads of cash to street vendors and children. He sponsored local soccer teams, built fields, and gave away jerseys. And everywhere he went, he smiled. He shook hands. He asked about people's families. He posed for pictures. He wasn't hiding. He was building a legend. Of course, not everyone saw it the same way. To the elite in Bogotá, Escobar was dangerous. His popularity among the poor made him more than a criminal. It made him untouchable. And that was exactly what he wanted. The goodwill he earned in the slums gave him protection. When authorities raided his properties, residents would tip off his men. When he was hiding from the law, it was the poorest communities that offered him shelter. He had created a network of invisible shields, ordinary citizens who saw him as a hero, not a villain. But Escobar's charity was never truly separate from his business. In every gift, there was a motive. In every favor, an expectation. He was building a parallel power structure, one that competed with the Colombian government. In Medellin, there were places the police would not go, but Escobar's men, they were always present, armed and watching. By creating dependence, he created dominance, and in doing so, he blurred the line between generosity and control. Still, for many, Pablo Escobar's legacy as a Robin Hood remains. Even today, murals of his face decorate walls in certain neighborhoods, and older residents still remember the day they were giving their first home, or the time he paid for their daughter's medicine, or the food basket that arrived when they had nothing left. It is a complicated memory, a man who brought joy and violence in equal measure. In the next chapter, we'll explore how Escobar used this public support to pursue his most ambitious goal yet, a career in politics. For years, Pablo Escobar had operated behind the curtain, a shadow figure with wealth, reach, and influence. But by the early 1980s, he was ready to step into the spotlight. He believed it was time to legitimize his power, to move from the jungle airstrips and hidden labs into Congress, into suits, into speeches. He wanted to be more than the king of cocaine. He wanted to be seen as a statesman. It began quietly. He joined a small political party known as the Liberal Alternative Movement, an offshoot of Colombia's mainstream Liberal Party. He didn't announce himself as a drug lord, of course. He presented a different image, a successful entrepreneur, a philanthropist from Medellin, a man of the people. And it worked. With campaign money flowing, Escobar earned influence inside the party. He funded events, made generous donations, and helped other candidates win elections. In return, they supported his ambitions. In 1982, it happened. Pablo Escobar was elected as an alternate congressman in Colombia's House of Representatives. It wasn't a full seat, but it was a foot in the door. Suddenly, Escobar had access to the political elite. He attended meetings, shook hands with high-ranking officials, walked the halls of Congress with a calm confidence. For a moment, it seemed possible that he might transform himself from outlaw to lawmaker. But not everyone was fooled. One man in particular, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, the Minister of Justice, began to speak out. Lara accused Escobar of being a narcotraficante, a drug trafficker hiding in plain sight. He gathered evidence, spoke to the press, and publicly denounced Escobar's presence in government. Escobar was furious. He had spent years crafting his image, years building alliances, and now a single voice threatened to bring it all down. He tried to fight back with money, then with legal threats, but Lara didn't back down.
Soon, Colombian media joined in. Newspapers published photos of Escobar's arrest in the 1970s for drug-related crimes. Questions arose about the source of his wealth. His past was now exposed, on front pages, in newsreels, across dinner tables. The scandal grew, and under pressure, the Liberal Party expelled him. His political allies vanished. His congressional privileges were revoked. Just like that, Escobar's dream of legitimacy crumbled. But he didn't forget who humiliated him, and in the world of Pablo Escobar, humiliation had consequences. In 1984, the consequences came. Rodrigo Lara Bonilla was gunned down by motorcycle assassins in Bogotá. The message was clear. Escobar's war with the state had begun. The government responded by reviving extradition treaties with the United States, agreements that would allow Colombian nationals to be tried and imprisoned abroad. To Escobar, extradition was worse than death. He would never be caged in a foreign land, and he would stop at nothing to make sure that never happened. With the war reaching unbearable levels and the state under immense pressure, Pablo Escobar made a move that surprised nearly everyone. He offered to surrender. But not just any surrender. He had conditions. He would stop the violence. He would end the bombings and assassinations. But in return, the government had to repeal the extradition treaty with the United States, and he would serve time in a prison of his own design. The government, weary of bloodshed and international embarrassment, agreed. And so, in 1991, Escobar walked into custody, smiling, waving to the cameras, as if he had won. Because in many ways, he had. He wasn't sent to a military base. He wasn't confined in isolation. He was taken to La Catedral, a private prison he had built himself, located in the hills above Medellin, surrounded by forest and fog. La Catedral was no ordinary prison. It had high walls and guards, yes, but the guards were loyal to Escobar. They didn't report to the state. They reported to him. Inside, the facility had a gym, a bar, a waterfall, televisions, a pool table, even a disco room. He invited guests at will, politicians, entertainers, and women. He threw parties. He conducted business. He continued to run the Medellin cartel as if nothing had changed. It was less a prison and more a mountaintop retreat for the most powerful criminal on earth. But the illusion wouldn't last. As word spread about the luxuries inside La Catedral and rumors circulated that Escobar was torturing and executing his own men within its walls, the Colombian government could no longer look away. Under mounting outrage, they decided to transfer Escobar to a more conventional facility. But when authorities arrived at La Catedral in 1992, they found the gates open, the guards gone, and Escobar vanished. He had simply walked out through the back into the misty hills he knew so well. The manhunt that followed would become one of the most intense operations in Latin American history. With the Medellin cartel weakened,
Escobar now without the protections of politics or a private prison, he became a fugitive. The government, with help from U.S. intelligence agencies, formed a special unit called the Search Block. Hundreds of soldiers and police officers were dedicated to one mission: find Pablo Escobar. They tapped phones, tracked relatives, raided safe houses, and in the shadows, another group emerged, a paramilitary organization known as Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, formed with one goal: to destroy everything Escobar had built. They targeted his associates, burned his properties, murdered his lawyers and accountants. The pressure from both the state and the underground was crushing. Escobar, once a billionaire surrounded by bodyguards, was now alone, moving from one safe house to another. He changed locations constantly. He stopped using phones. He wore disguises. He rarely slept in the same bed twice. Still, he called his family. He missed his children. He spoke to his wife in the dead of night using makeshift radio equipment or borrowed phones. Each call was a risk. Each moment of contact, a possible trap. But for Escobar, family was his last connection to a world that was rapidly slipping away. And eventually, it would be that connection that would betray him. On December 2nd, 1993, a call was intercepted. Escobar was traced to a modest home in a middle-class neighborhood of Medellin. The search block moved quickly. They surrounded the house. Inside, Escobar tried to flee, climbing to the rooftop, barefoot, armed, desperate. But he was spotted. Shots rang out. And just like that, after years of war, wealth, and fear, Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, once the most powerful drug lord on earth, lay dead on a rooftop in the city he once ruled. A single bullet wound to the head, blood on the red tiles, and silence. The hunt was over.
The news spread quickly, across Medellin, across Colombia, across the world. For some, it was a moment of relief. The man who had terrorized a nation for over a decade was finally gone. No more bombings, no more assassinations, no more headlines soaked in blood. People took to the streets, some in celebration, others in mourning. Because, despite everything, Pablo Escobar had not been a one-dimensional figure. To the poor in Medellin, he had been a provider, a savior, a man who would build homes when the government looked away. To others, he was a monster, a man who had plunged an entire country into chaos, who had ordered the deaths of thousands to protect his empire. And so, at his funeral, both grief and hatred stood side by side. More than 25,000 people attended. Some cried, some kissed his coffin, some prayed. His mother collapsed with sorrow. His widow kept her distance, worried for the safety of her children. The drug lord had died, but the danger was still very much alive. In the years that followed, Colombia would change. The Medellin cartel dissolved. Its leaders were either dead or in prison. The Cali cartel rose to power for a time, more discreet, more corporate, but still deadly. Eventually, the Colombian government regained control. With the help of international allies, they cracked down on the drug trade, reformed parts of the police and judiciary, and began the long, painful process of healing. But the wounds Escobar left behind ran deep. Entire generations had grown up under the shadow of his reign. Children who had seen murders in the streets, families torn apart by bombings, communities twisted by fear and loyalty. And yet, Escobar never truly disappeared. His image lingered on murals in Medellin, in books, in documentaries, in the minds of those who remembered the food he gave, the soccer fields he built, and the war he brought. Tourists now visit the sites tied to his story: La Catedral, his grave, his childhood home. Some come out of morbid curiosity, others to understand. But what they find is a complex legacy. A man who rose from poverty to become the wealthiest criminal in history. A father who loved his children, yet placed them in constant danger. A self-proclaimed savior of the poor who destroyed countless lives. Pablo Escobar is a name etched into modern history of Latin America, not just as a drug trafficker, but as a symbol of how power, money, and violence can collide in a single human being. His story is not just about cocaine. It's about a country that was caught between corruption and survival, between justice and fear, between truth and myth. And as night falls over the hills of Medellin, where his shadow once loomed the largest, there is only quiet now. The echoes of bombs have faded. The king is gone. But the world he shaped still remembers.